You know what's interesting about old clay tablets? Some of them say things that sound completely wild. There are these ancient Sumerian tablets sitting in museums right now, actual physical objects you could go see if you wanted, and they claim that beings called the Anunnaki came down from the sky and ruled Earth for 200 years. Not 200 years or 2,000 years, but 200 years. 8 kings before a great flood, each one ruling for tens of thousands of years. And here's the thing that makes people argue. These aren't vague myths or poetic stories. They're written in lists with numbers, like someone was trying to keep an actual historical record. So the question everyone keeps coming back to is pretty simple. Were the Anunnaki gods that people made up? Or were they memories of something real that actually happened? Hey, welcome. I'm really glad you're here tonight. It's probably late where you are, or maybe you're just winding down after a long day. Either way, thank you for being here. We're going to take our time with this. No rushing. Just exploring something genuinely mysterious and ancient together. You've got a few hours ahead if you want them, and we'll move at a pace that feels more like a conversation than a lecture. So, here's what we're dealing with. There's this document called the Sumerian King List, and it's one of the strangest things to survive from the ancient world. The best preserved copy lives at Oxford University now. It's called the Weld-Blundell Prism, and it's basically a clay column about 8 inches tall with writing on all 4 sides. Archaeologists found pieces of this list all over ancient Mesopotamia during the 1900s. The list does something really unusual. It starts way back before a catastrophic flood and names 8 kings who ruled for absurdly long periods. We're talking 2,800 years for one king, 4,200 years for another. Then after the flood, suddenly the reign lengths drop down to normal human lifespans, numbers that match up with other historical records we can verify. Most scholars say the long reigns are symbolic, just an ancient way of saying, this happened so long ago, we can't really know. But other researchers ask a fair question. If it's all made up, why does the list transition so precisely from mythic time to verifiable history? Why would they keep such detailed records if none of it meant anything? We're not here to pick a side tonight. Honestly, I don't know which interpretation is right, and neither does anyone else with complete certainty. What we can do is look at both views fairly, explore what these ancient people actually wrote down, see what archaeology has found, and sit with the mystery of what we still don't know. The interesting part isn't proving whether the Anunnaki were real or imaginary. It's that people 5,000 years ago left us these incredibly detailed records about beings they believed created their civilization, and we're still trying to figure out what they meant. Take a breath. Let your body relax a bit. Where are you listening from right now? Maybe you're already in bed with the lights off, or sitting somewhere comfortable as the day winds down. Wherever you are, you're okay. You're safe. For the next few hours, we're just going to wander through this together, through ancient tablets and lost cities, through what we know and what remains beautifully unclear. There's no pressure, nowhere else you need to be. If this is the kind of thing you enjoy, ancient history explored slowly and thoughtfully, I'd really appreciate if you'd like this video or subscribe. It genuinely helps other people who are looking for this type of content find their way here. Thank you. The tablets themselves are pretty amazing when you think about them. Picture a scribe sitting in some temple in ancient Sumer, maybe 4,500 years ago. He's got a chunk of wet clay smoothed out in front of him, and a reed stylus cut at an angle. He presses the stylus into the clay, making wedge-shaped marks, one after another, each one deliberate. The clay dries in the hot Mesopotamian sun or gets baked in a kiln, and what was soft becomes permanent. What he wrote stays written. That scribe knew he was making something that would outlast him, outlast his grandchildren, outlast his entire city. And he was right. We can still read what he pressed into that clay. The tablets that talk about the Anunnaki weren't rare or hidden away. They were mainstream literature in Sumerian culture, copied over and over by generations of scribes, translated into other languages as new empires took over. These weren't fringe conspiracy theories. This was just how they understood their own origins, how their cities began, how they got the knowledge to build civilization. They believed beings came from above and taught them, or ruled them, or created them for a purpose. So tonight we start where any good investigation starts, with the actual evidence, the physical objects, the things we can touch and measure and read. Before we go back thousands of years to imagine what the Anunnaki might have been, we should probably look at the actual objects that tell us about them. These aren't abstract myths floating in the air. They're physical things, made of clay and fired in kilns, sitting in storage rooms and display cases right now. The Sumerian tablets exist. You could book a flight to Oxford or Chicago or Istanbul, walk into a museum, and see them with your own eyes. That's worth remembering when the stories start to sound impossible. Somebody made these objects, pressed these words into soft earth, and believed what they were recording mattered enough to preserve. The clay itself came from the rivers. Mesopotamia means between the rivers, and those two rivers, the Tigris and Euphrates, carried silt down from the mountains of what's now Turkey, depositing it across the flat plains of modern Iraq. The clay was everywhere, free, workable. People had been shaping it into pots and bricks for thousands of years before anyone thought to write on it. When writing finally emerged around 3400 BCE, clay became the primary medium. Scribes would take a chunk of river clay, knead out the air bubbles, and flatten it into a rectangle or square, usually about the size of your hand. The surface had to be smooth, but still soft enough to take an impression. The stylus was a reed, cut from the marshes that covered much of southern Mesopotamia back then. The scribe would slice the reed at an angle to create a triangular tip, and then press that tip into the clay at different angles and depths to create marks. Each mark is called a cuneiform sign, from the Latin cunus, meaning wedge. A single sign might represent a sound, a word, or an idea, depending on context. It's not an alphabet in the way we think of one. It's more flexible and more complicated than that. Learning to read and write cuneiform took years of training in specialized scribal, schools attached to temples. Once the tablet was inscribed, it needed to dry. In the hot, dry climate of ancient Iraq, that happened naturally within hours. But dried clay is fragile. It crumbles easily. So important documents, contracts, royal decrees, religious texts, were often fired in kilns, baking the clay at high temperatures until it became nearly as hard as stone. That's why these tablets survived. A library that burned down accidentally fired thousands of tablets, preserving them when everything else turned to ash. The great irony of Mesopotamian archaeology is that destruction often meant preservation. The Sumerian king list exists in multiple copies. Archaeologists have found more than a dozen versions, fragments, and complete texts scattered across different sites and different time periods. The Weld Blundell prism, discovered in 1922 at Larsa in southern Iraq, is the most complete. It's now in the Ashmolean Museum at Oxford. The The prism stands about 20 centimeters, tall, roughly 8 inches, and has 4 sides, each covered with columns of tiny cuneiform signs. The scribe who made it probably worked around 2000 BCE during the Isin Larsa period, copying from older sources that no longer exist. He was recording what was already ancient history to him. Reading the list is straightforward at first. It begins, when kingship was lowered from heaven, kingship was in Eridu. Then it names the first king, Alulim, and says he ruled for 2,800 years. The second king, Alaungar, ruled for 36,000 years. The pattern continues through 8 kings and 5 cities. After the flood, the list states, the flood swept over. After the flood had swept over, when kingship was lowered from heaven, kingship was in Kish. From that point forward, the reign lengths become believable, first dropping to hundreds of years, then to decades that match what we know from other records. Mainstream Sumerologists interpret the pre-flood kings as mythological. They point to similar patterns in other ancient king lists, Egyptian dynasties that stretch back to the reign of the gods, Babylonian chronicles that begin with divine rulers, even the biblical genealogies in Genesis that give people lifespans of 900 years before the flood and normal lifespans after. It's a common literary device, they argue, a way of establishing that your civilization is ancient beyond measure, blessed by the gods from the very beginning of time. The Sumerians weren't trying to record literal history in those early sections. They were creating a sacred charter, explaining why their kings had the right to rule. But here's what gives the alternative interpretation some traction. The list doesn't read like pure mythology. It has the structure and tone of a historical document, organizing information chronologically, noting when kingship moved from one city to another after military defeats, including details that serve no obvious mythological purpose. And those enormous numbers aren't random. They follow patterns based on the Sumerian base 60 mathematical system. Some researchers have suggested the numbers might encode astronomical information, cycles of planets or stars observed over centuries and attributed to divine kings. Others propose the tablets preserve oral traditions from much older cultures, stories passed down through so many generations that the timescales became distorted, but the memory of powerful rulers remained. We don't have to choose one interpretation and dismiss the other. Both reveal something true. The mainstream view shows us how ancient people constructed legitimacy and meaning through sacred history. The alternative view reminds us that oral traditions can preserve kernels of real events across staggering spans of time, even when the details become transformed. What matters is that the Sumerians themselves took these records seriously enough to copy them carefully for over 1,000 years, translating them into Akkadian and Babylonian as their language evolved, making sure the memory didn't disappear. The tablets wait in their museum cases, patient as stone. The marks are still sharp. The clay that once bent under a scribe's hand now resists any pressure. And the questions pressed into that clay 4,000 years ago remain unanswered, hanging in the air of climate-controlled rooms where visitors pause to read the labels and wonder what exactly they're looking at. Long before anyone pressed the first wedge into wet clay, the land itself was being shaped by forces that operated on geological time. If you could somehow float above the Persian Gulf 18,000 years ago, during the peak of the last ice age, you'd see a landscape that barely resembles the modern Middle East. The Gulf didn't exist as we know it. Sea levels were 120 meters lower than today, and what's now underwater was a wide river valley where the Tigris and Euphrates met and continued southward for another 400 kilometers before reaching the ocean. The climate was cooler, drier. Glaciers held massive amounts of water locked up in ice sheets covering North America and Northern Europe. The planet felt different. As the Ice Age ended and temperatures rose, those glaciers began to melt. Sea levels climbed slowly at first, then faster. The lower reaches of the river valley flooded, and over several thousand years the Persian Gulf filled in, drowning valleys and pushing the coastline hundreds of kilometers northward. By 6000 BCE, the Gulf had roughly its modern shape, though it's still slowly changing today. This rising water wasn't a single catastrophic event. It happened over millennia, far too slowly for any human to notice in a lifetime. But it did create conditions that would eventually support something unprecedented. Dense populations, complex irrigation, the first cities. Picture the landscape around 6000 BCE, before Sumer existed as a recognizable civilization. The southern part of Mesopotamia was mostly marshland, a maze of reed beds and shallow lakes fed by the two great rivers. The Tigris and Euphrates didn't flow in fixed channels back then. They meandered and shifted, changing course after floods, creating and abandoning distributary channels. During the spring snowmelt in the mountains far to the north, water levels would surge, flooding vast areas of the plain. In summer, much of that water evaporated under a sun that burned the mud to cracked hardness. People lived there, but not in large numbers. Archaeological sites from the Ubaid period, roughly 6500 to 3800 BCE, show small villages scattered across the region, usually built on slightly elevated ground to escape the worst flooding. These weren't the Sumerians, not yet. They were whoever came before, the cultures whose names we don't know because they left no written records. They built reed houses, fished in the marshes, grew simple crops on the riverbanks where annual floods deposited fresh silt. They made distinctive pottery painted with geometric designs, and they buried their dead with care, placing food and tools in graves as though the dead might need them. They were fully human, fully intelligent, grappling with the same fundamental questions that would later occupy the Sumerians. Why are we here? What happens when we die? How do we make sense of forces we can't control? The rivers shaped everything. They brought water, obviously, but also fertile silt that made farming possible in an otherwise harsh environment. The silt carried minerals and organic matter, natural fertilizer that renewed the soil each year. But the rivers also brought danger. Floods could destroy villages, drown livestock, wash away stored grain. And the water arrived unpredictably, not in neat seasonal patterns like the Nile, but in surges that depended on distant snowmelt and rainfall the farmers couldn't see or predict. Learning to manage that water, digging channels to direct it, building levees to contain it, creating basins to store it, became the central challenge of life in this region. The sky above that landscape held the same stars we see now, wheeling through the same patterns. The Sumerians would later name the constellations and track the movements of planets with remarkable precision. But long before that, people watched the sky simply because it was the only constant in an unpredictable world. The stars didn't flood, they didn't dry up. They moved in cycles you could count on, returning to the same positions year after year. Maybe that regularity offered comfort. Maybe it suggested that behind the chaos of earthly life, some greater order existed. When we try to imagine the world that produced Sumerian civilization, we have to remember it wasn't a blank slate waiting for culture to appear. People had lived in Mesopotamia for thousands of years, adapting to its specific challenges, developing techniques that later cultures would build upon. They figured out which plants grew well in salty soil, how to weave reeds into baskets and mats and boat frames, where to build so floods wouldn't reach you, how to preserve fish and dates for storage. That knowledge accumulated slowly, passed from parent to child, refined through generations of trial and error. Archaeological evidence shows increasing complexity during the late Ubaid period. Villages grew larger, pottery became more standardized, suggesting some form of specialized production. Temple structures appeared, small at first, but clearly buildings set apart for ritual purposes rather than daily living. Trade networks expanded, bringing obsidian from Anatolia, carnelian beads from distant sources, copper that had to be smelted from ore. These weren't isolated farming villages anymore. They were nodes in a growing web of exchange and interaction. Then something shifted. Around 3800 BCE, the archaeological record shows a change that's dramatic enough to mark the beginning of what we call the Uruk period, named after the city of Uruk, that would become southern Mesopotamia's largest settlement. Population increased rapidly. Villages became towns, towns became cities. Monumental architecture appeared. Temples built on raised platforms, enclosure walls, public buildings that required organized labor to construct. And most importantly, writing emerged. Those first tablets weren't recording myths or king lists. They were tallying goods. So many jars of oil, so many bushels of grain, so many sheep, because the economy had become too complex to track in anyone's memory. The land between the rivers was ready. The stage was set. And into that landscape, equipped with irrigation technology and social organization, and the revolutionary tool of written language, the Sumerians would build something the world had never seen before. There was a time, not even that long ago on the scale we've been thinking about, when no one anywhere on Earth could read or write. Every human who had ever lived experienced the world without that ability. Knowledge existed only in memory and speech, passed from person to person, generation to generation, adapting and changing with each retelling. Think about what that meant. If you wanted to remember something important, a story, a technique, a genealogy, you had to memorize it, and you had to teach it to someone younger before you died, or it disappeared forever. Nothing was fixed. Nothing could be checked against a permanent record. Memory was everything, and memory is fragile. Oral cultures developed sophisticated techniques for preserving information. They used poetry and rhythm because metered verse is easier to memorize than prose. They used repetition, formulaic phrases, mnemonic devices. They trained specialists, bards, priests, elders, whose job was to memorize and recite important knowledge. And it worked to a point. We know it worked because oral traditions still exist today, and scholars have documented how accurately some cultures can transmit information across centuries without writing. But accuracy has limits. Stories drift. Details change. Over many generations, what started as a memory of real events can transform into something unrecognizable. This matters when we're trying to evaluate claims about the Anunnaki ruling for 200 years. If those stories existed in oral tradition before being written down, and they almost certainly did, then we have to ask how long they circulated without writing, how many generations passed them along, and what might have changed in the process. The Sumerian king list was written around 2000 BCE, but it describes events supposedly happening long before Sumerian civilization even existed. How much time elapsed between the alleged events and their first written record? Hundreds of years, thousands, more. Archaeological evidence from pre-literate Mesopotamia shows us people who were sophisticated, organized, capable of impressive achievements. At a site called Göbekli Tepe in southern Turkey, dated to around 9600 BCE, that's 11,600 years ago, people carved massive stone pillars and arranged them in circular enclosures. The stones weigh up to 20 tons each. The carvings show animals, abstract symbols, anthropomorphic figures. This was 6,000 years before writing, 5,000 years before the pyramids, at a time when conventional history tells us humans were just beginning to experiment with agriculture. Yet, clearly they could organize labor, plan large projects, create art with symbolic meaning. They must have had complex social structures, belief systems, ways of passing knowledge from master to apprentice. But we don't know what they believed. They left no text to explain their pillars. We have only the stones themselves, silent witnesses to intentions we can't fully grasp. In Mesopotamia, during the pre-literate periods, archaeology reveals similar sophistication. The Ubaid culture, flourishing from about 6,500 to 3,800 BCE, built temples, produced distinctive pottery, established long-distance trade networks. The Uruk period that followed, from 4000 to 3100 BCE, saw explosive urban growth before writing emerged. These people weren't primitive or simple. They navigated complex social hierarchies, managed irrigation systems that required coordination across multiple settlements, developed craft specialization that implies some form of administration. They accomplished all this through oral communication, demonstration, and memory. Stories from that pre-literate world might have included accounts of powerful figures from even earlier times, leaders or perhaps outsiders who brought knowledge, who founded cities, who seemed different from ordinary humans. As generations passed, the stories would naturally grow more elaborate. Timescales would stretch, details would blend with theology and cosmology. By the time writing appeared and scribes began recording the old stories, what had started as historical memory might have become mythology. Or what had started as mythology might have absorbed details from historical events. Separating the layers became impossible. The cognitive revolution that writing represents is hard to overstate. When the first Sumerian scribe pressed symbols into clay to record not just quantities but words, sentences, narratives, something fundamental changed. For the first time, human knowledge could exist outside human memory. It could be checked, compared, corrected. It could survive not just one generation, but indefinitely. The scribe who wrote the Sumerian king list was engaging in an act that would have been unthinkable to his ancestors 5 generations earlier, creating a permanent, external record that claimed to reach back to the beginning of time. But here's the unsettling part. The gap between pre-literate and literate culture creates a kind of event horizon in our understanding of the past. We can see physical artifacts, pottery, tools, buildings, bones, but we can't hear voices, can't read intentions, can't access the stories people told themselves about who they were and where they came from. When writing finally appears and we can hear those voices again, they're already talking about a deep past, about gods and kings and catastrophic floods, about beings from the sky who established order. Were they recording old memories that had been preserved with reasonable accuracy through oral tradition? Were they creating origin myths to explain their present circumstances? Were they doing both at once, blending history and theology in ways that made sense to them but confuse us? Flood myths appear across Near Eastern cultures, and some of them definitely predate written records. Geological evidence confirms that major flooding events did occur in Mesopotamia. Archaeological layers at Ur and Shuruppak show thick deposits of flood sediment dating to around 2900 BCE. Other flood evidence appears at different sites at different times. The Persian Gulf filled with water after the Ice Age, a process that would have seemed catastrophic to people living in low-lying coastal areas. These events happened in human memory, within the span of oral tradition, and the memory persisted even after the waters receded. But by the time scribes wrote the flood into the king list, and the Atrahasis epic, and the Epic of Gilgamesh, it had become more than geological event. It had become theological statement, divine judgment, the moment when old orders ended and new ones began. The world before writing was not less intelligent than ours. It was different. People observed the same stars, felt the same emotions, asked the same fundamental questions. They built impressive structures, developed complex societies, lived rich lives full of meaning and purpose. But without writing, they couldn't preserve detailed, verifiable records across vast spans of time. And that means when we encounter written claims about events in the distant past, claims about the Anunnaki, about impossibly long reigns, about beings from the sky, we have to recognize we're looking at something that passed through the filter of oral tradition before becoming text. Something changed in that passage. We just don't know how much. The invention of writing didn't just record history. In a sense, it created history as a concept. The idea that the past could be known with specificity, compared across sources, analyzed for accuracy. Before that, the past was story, and story is always a living thing, always shaped by the needs and understanding of the present moment. The Sumerians were the first people to fix the past in clay, making it possible for us, 4,000 years later, to wonder what they meant. Around 3400 BCE, something extraordinary happened in the city of Uruk. Someone pressed a reed stylus into a piece of soft clay and made marks that represented not just a picture of an object, but the idea of that object, the word itself. It's hard to pinpoint exactly when this shift occurred because the transition from pictographs to true writing happened gradually, but the earliest tablets we've found come from Uruk's Eanna Temple district and date to this period. These first attempts at writing don't look like the elegant cuneiform that would develop later. They're crude pictographs, simplified drawings of heads, bowls, fish, grain, but they're organized in a way that suggests syntax, grammar, the structure of language captured in physical form. The tablets weren't recording literature or history at first. They were accounting documents, inventories of temple goods managed by an increasingly complex bureaucracy. One tablet might list quantities of barley distributed to workers. Another might track sheep belonging to the temple. A third might record beer rations. And yes, the Sumerians were very interested in beer, documenting its production and distribution in careful detail. This tells us something important about why writing was invented. It wasn't to preserve myths or communicate with the gods. It was to manage stuff, to keep track of economic transactions that had become too numerous and complex for anyone to hold in memory. But once the technology existed, once people realized you could capture words on clay, the uses expanded rapidly. Within a few hundred years, scribes were recording not just quantities, but names, legal contracts, letters, prayers, and eventually the great myths and epics that had circulated in oral tradition for who knows how long. The Epic of Gilgamesh, one of the oldest surviving works of literature, was first written down around 2100 BCE. But the stories it contains were certainly much older, refined, and retold around countless fires before anyone thought to preserve them in clay. The physical act of writing cuneiform required skill and practice. The scribe would hold a reed stylus at a precise angle, usually about 45 degrees to the tablet's surface, and press the triangular tip into the soft clay to create a wedge-shaped impression. Different angles and pressures produce different marks. A sign might consist of just one wedge or as many as 20, each one positioned carefully in relation to the others. The signs were arranged in boxes or columns, read from left to right and top to bottom in the earliest texts, though the direction varied in different periods. Mistakes couldn't be easily erased. You either smoothed out the whole tablet and started over, or you pressed on and lived with the error. Learning this system took years. Young scribes, usually boys from wealthy families, attended temple schools called edubas, or tablet houses. They practiced by copying standard texts, repeating the same passages over and over until they could form each sign perfectly from memory. Thousands of practice tablets have been found, showing students' mistakes and corrections, the gradual improvement of their handwriting across months of training. The curriculum included not just writing, but mathematics, surveying, administration, and the literary classics. A fully trained scribe was an educated elite, someone who could move between the worlds of commerce, religion, and government. The evolution of cuneiform is visible in the tablets themselves. Early pictographic signs were complex, each one a simplified drawing that still resembled the object it represented. Over time, the signs became more abstract, more wedge-based, easier to write quickly. The number of signs decreased as the system became more efficient. By the time of the Akkadian Empire, around 2300 BCE, cuneiform had been adapted to write not just Sumerian, but other languages: Akkadian, Eblaite, Elamite, eventually Hittite, and Hurrian. It became the dominant writing system across the entire Near East, used for nearly 3,000 years before finally being replaced by alphabetic scripts. What's remarkable is how much information survived. Unlike papyrus or parchment, which decay rapidly in most climates, clay tablets are essentially indestructible if they've been fired or accidentally baked in building fires. Entire libraries have been recovered, their contents mostly intact. The Library of Ashurbanipal at Nineveh, destroyed when the city fell in 612 BCE, yielded over 30,000 tablets and fragments. The fire that consumed the palace inadvertently fired the tablets, preserving them for modern archaeologists to excavate in the mid-1800s. Those tablets included copies of the Sumerian king list, multiple versions of the flood story, astronomical observations, medical texts, literary works, administrative records, a whole civilization's knowledge frozen in clay. Reading these tablets today requires expertise. Cuneiform isn't a dead language that can be quickly deciphered by comparing it to known scripts. It had to be painstakingly decoded starting in the early 19th century, when scholars like Georg Friedrich Grotefend and Henry Rawlinson began working out the phonetic values of signs by studying trilingual inscriptions from Persia that included Old Persian, Elamite, and Babylonian. The breakthrough came slowly, sign by sign, as researchers compared texts and built up a vocabulary. By the 1850s, they could read Akkadian fairly well. Sumerian took longer because it's a language isolate, unrelated to any modern tongue, but by the early 20th century, scholars had learned to read it too. The scribes who created these tablets understood they were making permanent records. They sometimes included colophons, statements at the end of a tablet identifying the scribe, the date, and the circumstances of composition. One scribe might write, "Whoever alters this tablet, may the gods strike him down." Another might note, "Written at the command of the king in the palace at Ur." these small personal touches make the past feel suddenly closer. You're not just reading ancient information. You're reading words written by a specific person on a specific day, someone who had opinions and pride in their work and maybe tired hands by the end of a long copying session. When the Sumerian king list was written down, probably around 2000 BCE based on linguistic analysis, it was already drawing on sources that were centuries old. The scribe was compiling information from multiple earlier king lists, reconciling discrepancies, organizing everything into a coherent chronology. He was creating what he believed was an accurate historical record, beginning with the moment when kingship descended from heaven and continuing through to his own present day. Whether he believed the pre-flood kings literally ruled for tens of thousands of years, or understood those numbers as symbolic, we can't know. But he took the task seriously enough to copy every detail with care. Writing transformed memory from something fluid and living into something fixed and analyzable. And in doing so, it created the very possibility of the questions we're asking now. Questions about what really happened, about evidence and proof, about distinguishing history from myth. Before writing, those distinctions didn't exist in the same way. After writing, they became unavoidable. The most complete version of the Sumerian king list sits in a museum in Oxford, England, thousands of miles from the Mesopotamian soil where it was made. It's called the Weld-Blundell Prism, named after Herbert Weld-Blundell, the British antiquarian who acquired it in 1922. The object itself is surprisingly small, about 20 centimeters tall, roughly the size of a large coffee mug, and made of baked clay with a warm, reddish-brown color. It has 4 sides, each covered with neat columns of cuneiform text, around 250 lines total. The writing is tiny, precise, the work of a scribe who knew exactly what he was doing. You can still see where the stylus pressed into the clay, each wedge sharp and deliberate, even after 4,000 years. Weld-Blundell didn't find the prism himself. He purchased it from an antiquities dealer in Baghdad, who claimed it came from Larsa, an ancient Sumerian city in southern Iraq. This was during a period when archaeological finds were being rapidly excavated, often by local workers selling directly to collectors and museums. The documentation wasn't always reliable, but the prism's physical characteristics and the style of its cuneiform support the claimed provenance. The dealer also sold Weld-Blundell other tablets from Larsa, and many of those have been verified as authentic. In 1923, Weld-Blundell donated the prism to the Ashmolean Museum at Oxford, where it remains on permanent display. The text begins with a statement that sounds almost matter-of-fact. After the kingship descended from heaven, the kingship was in Eridu. Eridu was considered the oldest city in Sumer, located near the coast of the Persian Gulf. The list names the first king as Alulim, who ruled for 28,800 years. The second king, Alalangar, ruled for 36,000 years. After those two, kingship moved to the city of Bad Tibira, where 3 more kings ruled for a combined total of 108,000 years. Then to Larag for 1 king, to Sippar for 1 king, and finally to Shurupak for 1 king. 8 kings total across 5 cities, and when you add up their reigns, you get 240 years. Then the text states simply, the flood swept over. After this catastrophic break, the list resumes with a new beginning. After the flood had swept over and the kingship had descended from heaven, the kingship was in Kish. From this point forward, the reign lengths drop dramatically. The first king after the flood rules for 1,200 years, still impossible by normal human standards, but a huge reduction from what came before. A few kings later, reigns are measured in hundreds of years. Eventually, by the time you reach the later dynasties, the numbers become historically verifiable. Kings have reigns of 15 years, 25 years, 40 years, lifespans that match archaeological and textual evidence from other sources. Scholars have found this pattern fascinating and frustrating in equal measure. The conventional interpretation holds that the pre-flood section is purely mythological, a way of asserting the ancient legitimacy of Sumerian kingship by placing its origins in a time before time, when gods walked the earth and humans were young. Many ancient cultures used similar devices. The Egyptian king lists include dynasties of gods who ruled before human pharaohs. The Hindu tradition describes yugas, ages lasting hundreds of thousands of years when Dharma was different and human lifespans were vastly extended. The Bible gives pre-flood patriarchs like Methuselah lifespans of 900 plus years, which drop to normal lengths after the flood. It's a widespread pattern. Deep antiquity marked by exaggerated timescales, followed by a cataclysm, followed by more believable history. But here's what gives people pause. The transition from mythic to historic time in the Sumerian king list isn't random or vague. It's precise, methodical, organized around a specific event, the flood, and the numbers involved aren't arbitrary. They follow patterns based on Sumerian mathematics, which used a sexagesimal, or base 60, system. The number 3,600 appears repeatedly as a factor in the reign lengths. Some researchers have suggested these might encode astronomical observations, the 3,600-year cycle associated with certain planetary movements, or the precession of equinoxes, which takes roughly 26,000 years to complete. Could the pre-flood kings represent not literal rulers, but periods of astronomical observation, recorded in human terms? Another puzzle is that the king list exists in multiple copies from different time periods and locations, and while they vary in details, the basic structure remains consistent. The pre-flood kings and their reign lengths are remarkably stable across versions. If this were pure invention, you'd expect more variation, more creative adaptation. Instead, it reads like a document being carefully preserved and copied, as though later scribes believed they were transmitting accurate information. The archaeological record doesn't help as much as we'd like. We have no evidence of Sumerian civilization existing before about 3500 BCE. The cities named in the pre-flood section, Eridu, Bad Tabira, Larag, Sippar, Shurupak, are real places that archaeologists have excavated, but their occupation dates don't stretch back 200 to 41,200 years. Eridu's oldest levels date to around 5400 BCE at the earliest. That's ancient, certainly, but it's 6,000 years ago, not 240,000. If kings ruled those cities for tens of thousands of years each, where's the physical evidence? Where are the hundreds of generations of buildings, the massive accumulation of pottery and tools, the deep stratigraphic layers you'd expect from such prolonged occupation? Some alternative researchers propose that the numbers shouldn't be taken literally as years, but as something else. Symbolic units, coded information, or even measurements from a different calendar system. Others suggest the tablets preserve fragmented memories of a much older culture that existed before the Younger Dryas period, roughly 12,800 to 11,600 years ago, when global temperatures dropped rapidly and caused widespread environmental upheaval. Could stories of that lost culture have been passed down through oral tradition, becoming gradually mythologized until they were finally recorded as the pre-flood kings? Mainstream archaeology remains skeptical. The evidence overwhelmingly supports the view that complex civilization in Mesopotamia began around 4,000, 3,500 BCE and developed fairly rapidly from that point. there's no evidence of advanced urban cultures in the region before that date. The king list's pre-flood section, most scholars argue, serves a theological and political purpose. It establishes divine sanction for Sumerian rulership and connects the historical dynasties to a sacred past. The impossibly long reigns aren't meant to be historical. They're meant to inspire awe. Yet the document refuses to disappear quietly into the category of pure myth. It keeps asserting itself, detailed and specific, carefully copied across centuries by scribes who treated it as important knowledge. And at its core, it makes a claim that forces a choice. Either these beings called the Anunnaki, these kings who ruled before the flood, were gods, symbolic representations of divine power, or they were something else, something we don't fully understand, whose memory survived in distorted form until writing could finally capture it in clay. The prism sits in its display case, patient and silent, offering its text to anyone willing to read it, but declining to explain what that text actually means. The word Anunnaki appears throughout Sumerian, Akkadian, and Babylonian texts, but its meaning shifts depending on context and time period. The most common interpretation of the term breaks it down as Anunnaki, which translates roughly as princely offspring or offspring of Anu. Anu was the Sumerian sky god, the supreme deity in the earliest pantheons, though he was later displaced in importance by Enlil and other gods. The Anunnaki, then, were his children or descendants, divine beings who occupied various roles in the cosmic order. In some texts, the Anunnaki serve as judges of the underworld, determining the fates of the dead. The Epic of Gilgamesh describes them gathered in the assembly of the gods, making decisions about human destiny. In the creation epic Enuma Elish, which comes from Babylonian tradition but draws on earlier Sumerian sources, the Anunnaki are divine workers, younger gods who labored to dig canals and build structures before humans existed. In the Atrahasis epic, one of the most important texts for understanding how the Sumerians viewed the relationship between gods and humans, the Anunnaki complain about their workload, leading to a divine crisis that results in the creation of humanity. The Atrahasis story goes like this. In the beginning, the gods were divided into two groups, the Anunnaki and the Igigi. The Igigi were assigned the hard labor of maintaining the world, digging irrigation canals, dredging rivers, building temples. They worked for 40 years, the text specifies this number, until they finally rebelled. They threw down their tools, burned them in a fire, and marched to the house of Enlil, the chief god, demanding relief from their endless toil. The gods held a council to address the crisis. Enki, the god of wisdom and fresh water, proposed a solution: create a new being to take over the work. This being would be called Lulu, which means man, or more specifically, Lulu Amelu, meaning mixed worker. The creation process itself is described with surprising specificity. Enki and the goddess Ninmah, who specialized in birth and creation, mixed clay from the earth with the blood of a slain god. One of the Igigi, who had been a ringleader in the rebellion, and from this mixture formed the first humans. The text says they created 7 males and 7 females, gestated in the wombs of birth goddesses, and then brought forth into the world. These first humans were designed explicitly to serve the gods, to take over the labor the Igigi had refused. In return for their service, the gods would provide them with food, shelter, and the knowledge needed to survive. This isn't a creation story centered on divine love or humanity's special status. It's transactional. Humans exist because the gods needed workers. We're a solution to a labor problem. That's a very different cosmology from what appears in, say, the Hebrew Bible, where humans are created in God's image to have dominion over the earth. In the Sumerian view, humans are created to have dominion over nothing. We're the bottom of the hierarchy, serving beings who themselves serve higher beings. But the story also reveals something about how the Sumerians understood their relationship with the divine. The gods weren't distant or incomprehensible. They had needs, made mistakes, argued with each other, changed their minds. Enlil, the king of the gods, was often portrayed as harsh and quick to anger. When humanity grew too numerous and noisy, disturbing his sleep, he decided to destroy them entirely by sending a flood. Enki, on the other hand, was portrayed as humanity's benefactor, the god who pitied humans and secretly warned one man, Ziusudra, called Atrahasis in some versions, Utnapishtim in the Epic of Gilgamesh, to build a boat and save himself, his family, and representatives of all living things. The flood story appears in multiple Sumerian and Akkadian texts, with variations in detail but remarkable consistency in the basic narrative. The gods decide to destroy humanity. One god warns a righteous man. The man builds a boat according to specific divine instructions. The flood comes, covering the earth, lasting for days. Eventually, the waters recede. The man releases birds to test for dry land. First a dove, then a swallow, then a raven. When the raven doesn't return, he knows it's safe. He makes a sacrifice, and the gods, smelling the sweet savor, gather around. Enlil is initially furious that anyone survived, but eventually relents and grants the survivor and his wife immortality. This narrative appears in texts dating to at least 2000 BCE and likely circulated in oral tradition for centuries before that. The parallels with the biblical flood story in Genesis are obvious and have been recognized since the 19th century, when George Smith, a young scholar working at the British Museum, translated the flood tablet from the Epic of Gilgamesh in 1872. His announcement caused a sensation. Here was proof that the biblical flood wasn't a unique Hebrew tradition, but part of a much older Near Eastern mythological complex. The biblical authors had inherited their flood story from Mesopotamian sources, adapting it to fit their own theological framework. But what if there's a historical kernel beneath the myth? Geological evidence shows that catastrophic flooding did occur in Mesopotamia. At the archaeological sites of Ur and Shuruppak, excavators found thick layers of water-deposited sediment dating to around 2900 BCE, separating earlier occupation levels from later ones. These weren't minor floods. They would have been devastating to anyone living through them, destroying cities, drowning populations, reshaping the landscape. Could the memory of such events have been preserved in oral tradition, eventually being incorporated into the flood narratives that scribes later wrote down? Or could the flood story preserve an even older memory, the inundation of the Persian Gulf at the end of the Ice Age, when rising sea levels drowned vast coastal areas where people had lived for thousands of years? That process took millennia, but there may have been specific catastrophic events within it, moments when natural dams burst or shorelines collapsed rapidly. Survivors of such disasters would have passed their stories to children, who passed them to grandchildren, across so many generations that the timescales blurred, but the core memory, water rising, world ending, everything lost, persisted. The Anunnaki in these flood narratives are portrayed as divided in their attitude toward humanity. Enlil wants us gone. Enki wants us saved. Other gods take various positions between these extremes. This divine ambivalence mirrors something deeply human, the awareness that the forces governing our lives, whether we call them gods or nature or fate, are not uniformly benevolent or malevolent. They simply are, operating according to their own logic, sometimes helping us and sometimes indifferent to our suffering. When we read these texts now, we're faced with a choice about how to interpret them. Are they purely symbolic, poetic expressions of how ancient people understood their place in the cosmos, their relationship to nature and power and mortality? Or do they contain fragments of actual history, distorted by time and theology, but still pointing toward real events, real beings, real encounters that shaped the course of human development? The texts themselves don't resolve this question. They simply present their claims, detailed and specific, and wait for us to decide what weight to give them. The ancient Sumerians believed that before the flood, kingship descended from heaven, first to Eridu. This wasn't arbitrary mythology. Eridu was an actual place, and archaeological evidence suggests it may genuinely have been the oldest continuously inhabited settlement in southern Mesopotamia. The ruins lie in southern Iraq, about 24 kilometers southwest of the ancient city of Ur, now roughly 90 miles inland from the Persian Gulf. But 7,000 years ago, when people first settled there, Eridu sat much closer to the coast, perhaps even at the water's edge, where fresh river water met the salt sea. The geography mattered. Eridu's patron god was Enki, lord of the sweet waters that lay beneath the earth, and the city's location at the boundary between land and sea, fresh water and salt, gave it a liminal quality that seems to have been religiously significant. Excavations at Eridu, conducted primarily by Iraqi and British archaeologists between 1946 and 1949, revealed something remarkable. They found a temple, or rather, they found 18 successive temples built one on top of another at the exact same spot over a period of nearly 3,000 years. The earliest temple, a simple one-room mud brick structure measuring about 3 meters by 4.5 meters, dates to approximately 5400 BCE, making it among the oldest religious buildings ever discovered. Each time the temple collapsed or became unusable, the people of Eridu didn't abandon the site. They leveled the ruins, filled them in with clean sand to create a stable platform, and built a new temple directly above the old one. This pattern repeated again and again, each iteration slightly larger and more elaborate than the last, until by the final version in the late Ubaid period, the temple had grown to a substantial building with multiple rooms, decorated columns, and altar spaces. Why did they keep building in the same spot? The practical answer is that sacred space, once established, tends to remain sacred. Religious authority depends on continuity, on the claim that this place has always been holy, that rituals performed here connect to rituals performed by ancestors stretching back to the beginning. But there's something more visceral in the evidence at Eridu. The excavators found offerings buried in the foundation layers of each successive temple. Fish bones primarily, thousands of them. The remains of ritual meals eaten and then carefully placed beneath the new building. Fish were sacred to Enki, and these offerings suggest that each rebuilding was accompanied by ceremonies acknowledging the god's continued presence in this place. The people who built these temples believed they were maintaining a connection to something that had always been there. The final temple, Temple 1 in the archaeological sequence, was built around 4000 BCE on top of a massive platform that raised it several meters above the surrounding plain. By this time, Eridu had grown into a substantial town with several thousand inhabitants. The temple dominated the settlement, visible from a distance, a physical marker of the city's identity. Inside, priests performed daily rituals, offerings of bread and beer, hymns sung at sunrise and sunset, divination ceremonies to interpret the will of Enki. The temple was not just a place of worship, but an economic center, managing vast stores of grain and goods, employing laborers, administering land. In Sumerian cities, there was no clear separation between religious and secular authority. The temple was the city's heart. Eridu appears prominently in Sumerian mythology. The Eridu Genesis, known from a fragmentary tablet now in the University of Pennsylvania Museum, describes the city as the first to be created after the earth emerged from the primeval waters. The text states that after kingship descended from heaven, Eridu was established, and Enki was installed there as its divine ruler. The tablet goes on to describe the creation of humanity and the eventual decision by the gods to send a flood to destroy the world, though the section describing the flood itself is badly damaged. What survives is enough to show that Eridu held a special place in Sumerian cosmology. It was the beginning point, the first city, the place where divine and human realms first connected. Archaeological evidence supports Eridu's antiquity, if not its literal divine origin. The settlement shows continuous occupation from the Ubaid period through the Uruk period and into the early dynastic period, spanning roughly 5400 to 2000 BCE. During this immense stretch of time, the city witnessed the entire development of Sumerian civilization, the invention of irrigation, the rise of specialized crafts, the emergence of writing, the formation of city-states. Pottery styles changed. Building techniques evolved. Political structures became more complex. Through all this transformation, the temple remained, rebuilt and expanded, but always in the same sacred location. By the time the Sumerian king list was composed around 2000 BCE, Eridu's active religious life had already declined. The city was largely abandoned, its temple in ruins, though it continued to be remembered as a place of origin, a holy site from the age of the gods. Later Babylonian kings occasionally sponsored restoration work there, less for practical religious purposes than as a statement of connection to ancient legitimacy. But the city never regained its prominence. The memory, however, persisted. Standing in the ruins today, and they're still there, eroded mounds of mud brick, rising from the desert, you can trace the outline of that final temple, its walls worn down to knee height in some places, but still visible. The fish bones are long gone, carried off to museums, or simply dissolved into the soil, but the platform remains, a human-made hill testifying to thousands of years of continuous devotion. The site is quiet now, visited occasionally by archaeologists and almost no one else. The wind moves across it without obstruction, and somewhere beneath the surface, in layers that have never been fully excavated, lie the earliest temples, the fish offerings, the foundations of what the Sumerians believed was the first city, the place where it all began. When you list the verified achievements of Sumerian civilization, what emerges is a portrait of people who were startlingly sophisticated in their understanding of mathematics, astronomy, engineering, and administration. They invented the wheel, though perhaps invented isn't quite right. They developed the potter's wheel around 3500 BCE, and shortly after adapted the concept to transportation, creating wheeled vehicles that revolutionized trade and warfare. They were among the first to work bronze, heating copper and tin together to create an alloy harder than either metal alone, strong enough for tools and weapons that could hold a sharp edge. They developed complex irrigation systems, digging networks of canals that channeled water from the Tigris and Euphrates to fields miles away, transforming dry plains into productive farmland. Their mathematical system was based on the number 60, a choice that seems strange to us but had practical advantages. 60 is divisible by many numbers: 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 10, 12, 15, 20, 30, making calculations easier in a world without calculators. We still use this system today when we divide hours into 60 minutes and minutes into 60 seconds, when we measure circles in 360 degrees. The Sumerians understood fractions, could solve complex algebraic problems, and used geometry to calculate the areas of fields and the volumes of granaries. Hundreds of mathematical tablets have been found, including problem sets that look remarkably like homework assignments, showing students working through progressively more difficult calculations. Their astronomical knowledge was equally impressive. The Venus tablet of Amisaduqa, dating to around 1650 BCE but based on earlier Sumerian observations, records the rising and setting of Venus over a 21-year period with accuracy measured in minutes. The Sumerians tracked the movements of the moon so precisely that they could predict eclipses. They divided the sky into constellations, many of which we still recognize today: the bull, the lion, the scorpion. They understood that the year was roughly 365 days long and developed a calendar based on lunar months, adding extra months periodically to keep seasonal festivals aligned with the solar year. All this was accomplished without telescopes, using only naked eye observation, careful record keeping, and mathematical analysis. Their architecture shows a similar level of planning and skill. The ziggurats, massive stepped pyramid temples that dominated Sumerian cities, required sophisticated understanding of load-bearing structures, drainage systems, and material properties. The Great Ziggurat of Ur, built around 2100 BCE, still stands partially intact, its lower levels preserved well enough that you can see the details of construction. The core is solid mud brick, millions of bricks baked in kilns and laid in precise courses. The exterior was faced with fired bricks set in bitumen, a natural tar that served as waterproofing. Drainage channels were built into the structure to prevent water damage. The corners are oriented to the cardinal directions with remarkable accuracy, suggesting careful astronomical alignment during the planning phase. They had medical knowledge too. Hundreds of medical texts survive, describing symptoms, diagnoses, and treatments for various ailments. Some of the treatments sound reasonable even today, using honey as an antibacterial wound dressing, for example, or willow bark for pain relief, which contains the same active compound as modern aspirin. Others are more mystical, invoking divine intervention alongside practical remedies. But the diagnostic approach was often empirical, based on observation of symptoms and outcomes. Surgical techniques included setting broken bones, removing cataracts, and draining abscesses, procedures that required both knowledge and steady hands. Given all this documented capability, here's the question that keeps arising. Where did it come from? The mainstream archaeological narrative describes a gradual development, innovations building on previous innovations over centuries. The plow appears, leading to surplus food production. Surplus allows specialization. Specialists develop new crafts. Trade networks expand to obtain raw materials like copper and tin. Administration becomes necessary to manage complexity. Writing emerges to handle administrative needs. This is a reasonable progression, supported by stratigraphic evidence showing slow accumulation of material culture. But there's a counter-observation that alternative researchers emphasize. The appearance of advanced Sumerian civilization around 3500 BCE seems sudden, when you zoom out to the scale of human history. Anatomically modern humans had existed for nearly 200,000 years at that point. For most of that time, people were hunter-gatherers, living in small, mobile groups, leaving behind stone tools and occasional cave paintings. Then, in a relatively brief period, a few thousand years, we get settled agriculture, pottery, metallurgy, cities, writing, complex mathematics, astronomical observation, monumental architecture, all emerging in a cluster of related innovations. It's not impossible that this happened purely through human ingenuity responding to new environmental conditions at the end of the Ice Age. But it is, some argue, surprisingly rapid. This is where the interpretation of the Anunnaki as culture bearers gains some traction. If beings with advanced knowledge did interact with early humans, teaching specific technologies and organizational methods, you might expect to see exactly this pattern: a relatively sudden flowering of civilization, with multiple complex innovations appearing together rather than in gradual sequence. The Sumerian texts themselves support this reading. They consistently describe civilization as something received from the gods, not something developed independently. The ME, those divine principles or powers that included everything from kingship to basket weaving, were understood as gifts from Enki, brought up from the sacred city of Eridu and distributed to humanity. The texts describe the Anunnaki teaching humans agriculture, showing them which plants to cultivate and how to manage irrigation. They describe the gift of writing as coming from the goddess Nisaba or the god Nabu, divine scribes who revealed the sacred signs. They describe craftsmanship as learned from Ninurta, musical arts from Ningirsu, healing from Ninisina. This consistent pattern, humans as receivers rather than inventors, might be dismissed as normal mythological thinking, the tendency to attribute cultural achievements to divine rather than human agency. Every culture does this to some extent, but it might also preserve a memory of actual knowledge transfer from a more advanced group, whether that group was extraterrestrial, as some theories propose, or simply an earlier human civilization whose achievements were later mythologized. The archaeological record has gaps. The majority of ancient sites remain unexcavated. Coastal areas where people would have naturally settled have been underwater since the end of the Ice Age. We keep discovering that humans were capable of sophisticated behavior much earlier than we thought. The recently excavated site of Göbekli Tepe in Turkey pushed back monumental architecture by 6,000 years. Each new discovery recalibrates our understanding. What we can say with confidence is that the Sumerians themselves didn't claim to have invented their civilization. They claimed they received it, that the knowledge came from somewhere else, from beings who descended from heaven and established order where there had been chaos. Whether that's metaphorical or literal remains one of the great open questions. In Sumerian theology, civilization wasn't an abstract concept or a gradual social development. It was a collection of discrete elements called the Me, pronounced Me, often translated as divine powers or divine decrees. These were fundamental principles or attributes that made civilized life possible. Everything from kingship and priesthood to metallurgy and music, from sexual intercourse to legal judgment. The texts list over 100 different Me, though the exact number varies depending on the source. They weren't just ideas. They were somehow substantial, things that could be possessed, transferred, or stolen. The most famous story about the Me involves the goddess Inanna and the god Enki. The tale is preserved on several cuneiform tablets dating to around 2000 BCE, though the story itself is certainly older. It goes like this. Inanna, the goddess of love and war, traveled to Eridu to visit Enki, lord of wisdom and keeper of the Me. Enki greeted her warmly, perhaps too warmly. The text makes clear he'd been drinking beer, lots of it, and was in an expansive, generous mood. He hosted a feast in Inanna's honor, and as the beer flowed, he began offering her gifts. Not ordinary gifts, but the Me themselves, the fundamental powers of civilization. He gave her the crown of kingship, the throne, the scepter. He gave her the art of metalwork, the craft of the carpenter, the skill of the leather worker. He gave her truth and lies, victory and defeat, sexual intercourse and prostitution, the art of musical instruments and the lament. Each time he offered another Me, Inanna accepted it, gathering them to herself. In total, Enki gave her more than 80 of the Me before he finally passed out drunk. When he woke the next morning, sober and horrified, he realized what he'd done. He'd given away the fundamental powers that belonged to Eridu, transferred them to Inanna, who was already loading them onto her boat of heaven to sail back to her own city, Uruk. Enki sent his servant Isimud to intercept her and demand the Me's return. Isimud caught up with Inanna at 6 different stopping points along the journey, and each time he demanded the Me back, and each time Inanna refused, saying Enki had given them freely and she wouldn't return them. Eventually, she reached Uruk safely and distributed the Me throughout her city, making Uruk the new center of civilization and power. This story works on multiple levels. On one level, it's a political narrative explaining how Uruk, a relatively young city, surpassed older centers like Eridu in importance. On another level, it's about knowledge transfer, showing how cultural achievements spread from one place to another, sometimes through deliberate exchange, but other times through theft or accident. And on a symbolic level, it suggests that civilization itself is precarious, dependent on the possession and preservation of specific knowledge that can be lost if it's not carefully guarded. The concept of the Me implies something specific about how the Sumerians understood cultural knowledge. It wasn't innate to humans. It wasn't something we could just figure out on our own through trial and error. It had to be given to us, either by the gods directly or through human intermediaries who had access to divine knowledge. This parallels myths from other cultures. Prometheus stealing fire from the gods to give to humanity, Quetzalcoatl bringing the arts of civilization to Mesoamerica, the Norse god Odin hanging on the world tree to gain knowledge of the runes. There's a cross-cultural pattern of viewing civilization as something humans received rather than something they independently created. Alternative interpretations of the Anunnaki suggest this mythological framework preserves memories of actual knowledge transfer. If advanced beings did interact with early humans, teaching agriculture, metallurgy, writing, and mathematics, then the Me might be a mythologized way of describing that transfer, specific skills and technologies given by teachers who seemed godlike in their capabilities. The fact that the Me are described as discrete, countable items rather than vague inspiration supports this reading. They're more like a curriculum than divine blessing, a specific set of competencies that had to be learned and practiced. Mainstream scholarship views the Me as a theological construct, a way of organizing and categorizing the elements of culture within a religious framework. The Sumerians lived in a world where everything had divine significance, where no clear line separated the sacred from the secular. Of course, they would conceptualize cultural achievements as divine powers rather than human inventions. The story of Inanna stealing the Me from Enki is just that, a story, a way of explaining historical power shifts through mythological narrative. But even accepting the mainstream view, the concept reveals something interesting about Sumerian epistemology. They understood that civilization depends on specific knowledge, that this knowledge can be lost if it's not properly transmitted, and that control of knowledge is a form of power. These are sophisticated insights, and they suggest a culture that was conscious of its own contingency, aware that what had been built could also be destroyed, that the knowledge enabling their way of life wasn't inevitable or guaranteed, but had to be actively preserved and passed on. The tablets that describe the ME are among the most carefully copied texts in the Mesopotamian literary tradition, suggesting they were considered important, worth preserving. And perhaps that's the point. Whether the ME were literal divine gifts or metaphorical representations of cultural achievements, the Sumerians understood they represented something precious, something that required attention and care to maintain. The knowledge could be stolen, lost, or destroyed. It had to be guarded and renewed, generation after generation, or it would slip away and be forgotten. If the Anunnaki were the principal gods, the great ones who ruled and judged and shaped cosmic policy, the Igigi were something else, a lesser class of divine beings whose role in Sumerian cosmology is both specific and puzzling. The texts describe them as workers, laborers assigned to tasks that the Anunnaki themselves didn't want to perform. In the Atrahasis epic, which provides the most detailed account, the Igigi are described as digging canals, dredging rivers, and performing hard physical labor in what the text calls heaven, or the upper world, while the Anunnaki supervised from below or managed affairs on earth. The distinction between Anunnaki and Igigi isn't always clear or consistent across different texts and time periods. Sometimes they seem to be separate groups entirely, with the Igigi serving the Anunnaki in a relationship that resembles master and servant, or parent and child. Other times, the terms seem almost interchangeable, both referring generally to divine beings who rank below the highest gods like Anu, Enlil, and Enki. But in the creation narratives, particularly in Atrahasis, the distinction matters because it drives the plot. The Igigi's rebellion against their labor is what prompts the creation of humanity. According to Atrahasis, the Igigi worked for 40 years. The text is specific about this number, performing back-breaking labor to maintain cosmic infrastructure. They dug the Tigris, dug the Euphrates, carried baskets of excavated earth, clearing waterways that would benefit the Anunnaki. The work was endless and exhausting. Finally, they'd had enough. The text describes their rebellion in vivid terms. They set fire to their tools. They marched at night to the house of Enlil. They surrounded his dwelling and demanded relief. Enlil was frightened by the rebellion and called an emergency council of the gods to address the crisis. Anu asked who was responsible for starting the rebellion. Enlil wanted to punish the ringleaders, but Enki, always portrayed as more sympathetic to workers and humans, proposed a different solution. Instead of punishing the Igigi, he suggested creating a new being who could take over the labor, a creature called Lulu, meaning man or mixed worker. The goddess Nintu, also called Mami or Belet Ili, depending on the text, agreed to help. She and Enki would create this new being by mixing clay with the flesh and blood of a slain god. The text specifies which god was sacrificed. Ila, described as one of the Igigi, who had intelligence, suggesting he was a leader or instigator of the rebellion. His blood would give the created beings intelligence and spirit. The clay would give them physical form tied to the earth. This mixture of divine and earthly elements would make humans capable of the work the Igigi had refused, but mortal, limited, subject to the will of the gods who created them. The creation happened in batches, 7 males and 7 females, gestated in the wombs of birth goddesses and then brought forth. This narrative raises interesting questions when read through different interpretive lenses. The mainstream theological reading sees it as an etiology, an origin story explaining why humans exist and why we labor. It places humanity in a subordinate position, created for divine convenience, valued for our utility rather than our intrinsic worth. This reflects the social realities of Sumerian life, where most people were laborers serving temple estates and palace bureaucracies, where hierarchy was absolute, and the idea of questioning your place in the cosmic order would have seemed absurd or dangerous. But alternative readings focus on the specificity of the account. Why describe the Igigi as working in heaven or the upper world rather than on earth? Some researchers interpret this as evidence of a two-tiered operation: the Anunnaki on the planetary surface, the Igigi in orbit or on a space station, performing tasks related to resource extraction or infrastructure maintenance. The rebellion narrative would then describe a labor dispute among a colonizing force, with humans created as a replacement workforce using genetic engineering, mixing clay with divine blood, being a metaphorical description of combining local hominid genetics with advanced DNA. This interpretation requires significant extrapolation beyond what the texts explicitly state, and mainstream scholars reject it as reading modern science fiction concepts into ancient mythology. But proponents argue it makes sense of otherwise puzzling details. The distinction between heaven and earth as workplaces, the emphasis on hard physical labor that immortal beings would logically want to avoid, the specific process of combining earthly and divine elements to create a new type of being, the purpose-built nature of humans as workers. What's undeniable is that Sumerian theology consistently portrays humans as created for service, not as an end in themselves. This shows up repeatedly across texts. The gods created us to tend their gardens, build their temples, prepare their offerings, sing their praises. We exist to serve. In return, they provide protection, fertility, justice, the knowledge needed to survive. It's a contractual relationship, and like all contracts, it can be broken if either party fails to uphold their obligations. The Igigi largely disappear from later texts. The creation of humanity solves the labor crisis. They fade into the background. Some scholars suggest they were absorbed into the category of Anunnaki as Mesopotamian theology evolved and simplified over centuries. Others propose they became associated with stars, divine beings residing in the heavens, but no longer actively involved in earthly affairs. The memory of their rebellion and the solution it prompted persisted, though, encoded in creation narratives that were copied and recopied for over 1,000 years. The practical question underlying all this is, what does it mean for a culture to define itself through narratives of service to higher beings? Does it reflect resignation to social hierarchy, acceptance that some entities will always have power over others? Or does it preserve a historical memory of a time when humanity genuinely was subordinate to a more advanced group, when we learned our foundational technologies from teachers who seemed godlike? The texts don't answer this. They simply state what the Sumerians believed, that we were created to work, that civilization was given, not achieved, and that somewhere in the heights above us, beings of greater power once labored and rebelled, and made decisions that shaped our existence. The Sumerians watched the sky with an intensity that's hard for us to fully appreciate now. Living as we do under light-polluted skies, where only the brightest stars penetrate the orange glow of cities. In ancient Mesopotamia, the night sky was spectacular, a dome of crystalline darkness scattered with thousands of visible stars, the Milky Way a river of light arching overhead, planets moving in their slow, wandering paths against the fixed background of constellations. For people whose lives depended on agricultural cycles, who needed to know when to plant and when to harvest, the sky was a calendar, a clock, and perhaps something more, a map showing connections between heaven and earth that went deeper than simple timekeeping. The ziggurats themselves seem to have served astronomical purposes alongside their religious functions. These massive stepped pyramids weren't just impressive architecture. They were platforms for observation, raising priests high above the surrounding plain where they could watch the horizon unobstructed, noting the precise points where the sun rose at solstice, tracking the movements of Venus and Jupiter, marking the heliacal rising of important stars. The Great Ziggurat of Ur, one of the best preserved examples, has its corners aligned to the cardinal directions with an accuracy of less than 1 degree. This wasn't accidental. It required careful surveying, probably using stellar observations to establish true north, then translating that knowledge into physical construction with remarkable precision. The zodiac, those 12 constellations that the sun appears to move through over the course of a year, may have originated in Mesopotamia, though the dating is uncertain. Babylonian star catalogs from around 1000 BCE clearly identify zodiacal constellations, but the concept almost certainly existed earlier in Sumerian culture. What's interesting is the parallel between 12 zodiacal divisions and 12 major gods in the Sumerian pantheon. Some researchers see this as coincidence or natural symmetry. Many cultures organize things in groups of 12 because it's a highly divisible number. Others suggest a deeper connection, that the gods were somehow mapped onto celestial structures, each deity associated with a particular region of the sky and a particular constellation. There's a controversial object that gets brought up frequently in discussions of Sumerian astronomical knowledge: cylinder seal VA-243, housed in the Vorderasiatisches Museum in Berlin. It's a small stone cylinder, carved around 2500 BCE, designed to be rolled across wet clay to create an impression showing figures and symbols. Most of the seal depicts what appears to be a presentation scene, a seated figure receiving a visitor, common iconography in Mesopotamian art. But in the upper left portion of the seal, there's a symbol that some interpret as a star or sun surrounded by smaller circles, usually taken to represent planets. Alternative researchers, particularly those proposing ancient astronaut theories, have argued that this seal depicts our solar system with an unusual feature: an extraplanet beyond the known ones, sometimes identified with Nibiru, a hypothetical planet that supposedly orbits the sun in a long elliptical path and was home to the Anunnaki. The argument goes that ancient Sumerians couldn't have known about the outer planets, Uranus, Neptune, Pluto, without advanced technology or information from an external source, so the seal must represent knowledge given to them by the Anunnaki themselves. Mainstream astronomers and archaeologists strongly dispute this interpretation. They point out that the symbol in question is far more likely to represent a star, probably the sun, surrounded by smaller celestial bodies that could be anything from planets to moons to purely symbolic elements. There's no evidence the Sumerians knew about planets beyond Saturn, which is the furthest planet visible to the naked eye. The outer planets weren't discovered until the telescope age: Uranus in 1781, Neptune in 1846. Reading the seal as a diagram of the solar system with previously unknown planets requires significant interpretive leaps that aren't supported by other Sumerian astronomical texts. That said, the Sumerians did possess impressive astronomical knowledge. They tracked Venus with great precision, compiling tables that recorded its rising and setting over decades. The Venus tablet of Amisaduqa, dating to around 1650 BCE but drawing on older observations, contains 21 years of Venus data accurate to within minutes. They understood the difference between planets and stars. Planets wander against the fixed background. Stars maintain their relative positions. They tracked the lunar cycle with such accuracy that they could predict eclipses years in advance. They knew the length of the solar year to within hours. All this was accomplished through patient naked-eye observation, mathematical analysis, and meticulous record-keeping spanning generations. The question that hovers beneath these discussions is whether the Sumerians might have inherited astronomical knowledge from an earlier source. The precession of the equinoxes, the slow wobble of Earth's axis that causes the positions of stars to shift over a cycle of approximately 25,120 years, is sometimes cited as knowledge the Sumerians possessed but shouldn't have been able to discover on their own. Identifying precession requires continuous observation over many centuries, comparing star positions across generations and detecting tiny shifts. Some researchers argue that Sumerian astronomical constants and cycles encode awareness of precession, suggesting either that their civilization was much older than we think, or that they inherited knowledge from a predecessor culture that had observed the sky for millennia. Evidence for this claim is contested. Mainstream scholars point out that the earliest clear reference to precession comes from the Greek astronomer Hipparchus, around 130 BCE, over 1,000 years after the Sumerian period ended. While Babylonian astronomical texts are sophisticated, they don't explicitly mention precession. Any precession knowledge attributed to earlier Sumerians is inferred from numerical patterns and cycles that might have other explanations. It's possible the Sumerians noticed precession, possible they didn't, and our current evidence doesn't definitively resolve the question. What's undeniable is that astronomy was central to Sumerian religion and statecraft. The movements of celestial bodies weren't just interesting phenomena, they were messages from the gods, omens that had to be interpreted by trained specialists. A lunar eclipse occurring at the wrong time could be catastrophic for a king's legitimacy. The heliacal rising of Sirius might signal the proper time for religious festivals. Venus's appearance in the morning versus evening sky carried different meanings. The sky was a text to be read, and priests who could read it accurately held significant power. Perhaps the most intriguing aspect of Sumerian astronomical knowledge is how it integrates with their creation mythology. The Enuma Elish describes the formation of the cosmos through divine conflict. Marduk defeating Tiamat and splitting her body to create heaven and earth. Some alternative researchers read this as a mythologized description of planetary formation or catastrophic cosmic events witnessed by an ancient culture. Mainstream scholars see it as standard creation mythology, using cosmic violence to explain the origin of order from chaos. Both interpretations acknowledge that the Sumerians were attempting to understand the structure of the universe, using the conceptual tools available to them. The sky above Mesopotamia still turns through the same patterns it did 5,000 years ago. The stars the Sumerian priests named and tracked are still there, their light reaching us across the same vast distances. And the questions those priests asked: what keeps the stars in motion? Why do patterns repeat? What connection exists between the heavens and human fate? Are questions we're still exploring, using telescopes and mathematics they never imagined, but driven by the same fundamental wonder. The flood appears so often in Sumerian and Akkadian texts that it functions as a chronological marker, a before and after moment that divides mythic prehistory from recorded history. The Sumerian king list uses it as an absolute boundary: 8 kings before the flood with impossible reigns. Then the flood sweeps over, then kingship descends from heaven again, and historical time begins. The Atrahasis epic devotes much of its narrative to explaining why the flood happened and how one man survived. The Epic of Gilgamesh includes the flood as a crucial subplot when Gilgamesh meets Utnapishtim, the flood survivor who gained immortality. Across multiple texts and versions, the basic story remains consistent. The gods decided to destroy humanity with a catastrophic deluge. One god warned a righteous man. That man built a boat following divine specifications. The waters rose and covered the earth. Eventually they receded, and the survivor made sacrifice to the gods. The question that matters for our purposes is whether this narrative preserves memory of an actual event or functions purely as theological metaphor. And the answer, frustratingly, might be both at once. Geological evidence confirms that major flooding did occur in Mesopotamia during the periods when Sumerian culture was developing. At the ancient city of Shuruppak, which appears in flood narratives as the home of the flood hero, archaeologists found a layer of water-deposited sediment approximately 60 centimeters thick, separating earlier occupation levels from later ones. Radiocarbon dating places this flood around 2900 BCE. Similar flood deposits appear at Ur and other sites, though not always at the same dates, suggesting multiple severe flooding events rather than a single universal flood. The Tigris and Euphrates are unpredictable rivers fed by snowmelt from distant mountains. When conditions aligned, heavy winter snows followed by rapid spring warming, the volume of water surging downstream could overwhelm even well-maintained levees and inundate vast areas of the flat Mesopotamian plain. To people living through such a flood, the experience would have been absolutely catastrophic. Imagine water rising over the course of days until it covered everything visible to the horizon. Your village is underwater, your neighbors drowned, your livestock lost, your stored grain destroyed. You've taken refuge on whatever high ground exists, watching the water rise and wondering if it will ever stop. The flood doesn't cover the entire planet, but to you, it might as well. Your entire known world is submerged. When the waters finally recede, weeks or months later, the landscape is transformed, muddied, corpses of animals and people caught in debris, a layer of silt covering everything. Surviving that would leave traumatic memories, stories you'd tell your children with the weight of lived experience, stories they'd pass to their children across generations until the specific details blurred, but the core memory, water rising, world ending, everything lost, persisted. But there's another possibility that some researchers explore, though it requires reaching back much further in time. At the end of the last ice age, roughly 11,700 years ago, massive amounts of water locked in glaciers began melting. Sea levels rose approximately 120 meters over several thousand years, drowning coastal areas worldwide. The Persian Gulf, which had been a river valley during the Ice Age, filled with water, submerging vast areas where people had likely lived for millennia. This inundation happened slowly by human standards, centimeters per year, not enough for any individual to notice, but it could have included catastrophic events when natural ice dams burst or coastal shelves collapsed suddenly. The Black Sea flood hypothesis, proposed by geologists William Ryan and Walter Pittman in the 1990s, suggests that around 5600 BCE, the Mediterranean Sea broke through a natural dam at the Bosphorus and flooded into the Black Sea basin, which had been a large freshwater lake surrounded by settlements. The flood would have been sudden and devastating, raising the Black Sea's level by hundreds of meters and submerging approximately 100,000 square kilometers of inhabited land. If populations living around the Black Sea witnessed this catastrophe, survivors fleeing south might have carried the memory with them, and that memory could have eventually influenced the flood narratives that developed in Mesopotamian culture. The mainstream scholarly position holds that the biblical and Mesopotamian flood stories derive from memories of severe but local flooding events in Mesopotamia, mythologized and theologized over time, until they became accounts of divine judgment and world-destroying catastrophe. The stories serve religious and literary purposes. They explain divine human relationships, the fragility of human life, the importance of obedience to divine will. The fact that over 200 cultures worldwide have flood myths is explained either by the universality of flooding as a natural disaster or by cultural diffusion, stories spreading along trade routes and being adapted to local contexts. Alternative researchers argue that the widespread distribution of flood myths and their common elements, divine warning, boat building, survival of a chosen family, emergence into a changed world, suggests a real global or near global catastrophe in human prehistory, possibly at the end of the Ice Age, preserved in collective memory across cultures that had no contact with each other. The flood becomes not just a Mesopotamian event, but a species-wide trauma, encoded in story form, because that was the only way pre-literate cultures could preserve historical memory across vast spans of time. What the Sumerian flood narratives reveal about the Anunnaki is equally interesting. In every version, the gods are divided. Enlil wants humanity destroyed. We've become too numerous, too noisy, disturbing his rest. Other gods apparently agree, or at least don't object strongly enough to prevent the decision. But Enki opposes the plan. He pities humanity, or perhaps feels responsible for us since he was involved in our creation, and he can't bear to see us completely destroyed. So he finds a loophole. He can't directly warn Ziusudra or Atrahasis or Utnapishtim, depending on the text, because that would violate the divine decree, but he can speak to the wall of Ziusudra's reed house. And if Ziusudra happens to overhear, well, that's not Enki's fault. This portrayal of divine politics, competing agendas, moral disagreements, clever evasions of established rules, makes the gods seem remarkably human. They're not omniscient or perfectly unified in purpose. They make decisions that some of them later regret. When the flood is over and Enlil realizes someone survived, he's initially furious, but after listening to arguments from other gods, he relents and even grants Utnapishtim immortality as compensation for the suffering inflicted. It's a strangely pragmatic theology, one that acknowledges power structures and moral ambiguity rather than insisting on divine perfection. If you read the flood story as literal history involving actual beings called Anunnaki, then it becomes an account of a decision to eliminate an experimental population that had somehow failed to meet expectations, with one faction dissenting and ensuring survival of a remnant. If you read it as theological metaphor, it becomes a meditation on divine justice, mercy, and the value of human life in a cosmos governed by powers that don't always agree on how to wield their authority. Both readings acknowledge something important, that the relationship between the powerful and the powerless is complicated, that survival sometimes depends on finding sympathetic allies among those who hold power, and that catastrophic events, whether natural or directed, can reset civilizations while leaving memories that persist for millennia. The rain has stopped falling in Mesopotamia. The rivers flow in their channels, managed by modern dams and irrigation systems that would have amazed the ancient engineers. But the stories remain, preserved in clay tablets that survived their own kind of flood. Time itself, that slow erosion that destroys most human things, but sometimes, inexplicably, leaves fragments intact. The Sumerian creation account in the Atrahasis epic describes human origins with specificity that can feel unsettling when you read it closely. This isn't a vague myth about gods breathing life into dust. It's a procedure, almost clinical in its details, describing a deliberate process of mixing materials to create a new type of being. The text says that Enki and the goddess Ninmah, also called Nintu or Belet Ili, the Lady of the Gods, worked together to create humanity. They took clay from a specific location, mixed it with the blood and flesh of a slain god named Weila, and from this mixture formed the first humans. The text specifies that 14 birth goddesses were assembled to gestate these created beings, 7 producing males and 7 producing females. The term used for these first humans is revealing, Lulu Amelu, which translates as mixed worker or primitive worker. The word Lulu emphasizes the hybrid nature of the creation, part earthly, part divine, created for a specific purpose. Later, Akkadian texts sometimes use the term Adamu, which simply means human or earthling, but carries connotations of being formed from clay or earth, the same root that appears in the Hebrew Adam from the Genesis creation account. These linguistic connections show how the Mesopotamian creation tradition influenced later biblical narratives, ideas flowing across cultures and centuries. The blood of the slain god Weila was supposed to give humans something the Igigi possessed, te emma, usually translated as personality, spirit, or consciousness. Without this divine component, the created beings would be mere flesh, alive but not truly aware. With it, they became capable of intelligence, language, memory, the qualities that make humans different from animals. The clay provided the physical form, the vessel, grounding the creation in the material world and ensuring mortality. Gods might live forever, but creatures made partially from earth would age and die, returning to the soil from which they came. Modern readers encountering this account sometimes interpret it through the lens of genetic engineering. The mixing of clay with divine blood becomes, in this reading, a metaphorical description of combining genetic material from two sources: indigenous hominids, clay, earthly beings, and the Anunnaki, divine blood, advanced genetic material. The involvement of birth goddesses who gestated the created being sounds, to modern ears like surrogacy or artificial wombs. The emphasis on creating Lulu, mixed beings, suggests hybridization, the production of a new species through intentional breeding or genetic manipulation. This interpretation requires significant extrapolation. The text uses the language and concepts available to ancient Mesopotamian culture: gods, blood, clay, divine essence. Reading these as coded descriptions of biotechnology assumes either that the ancient writers were deliberately encoding scientific procedures in mythological language, or that they were describing processes they witnessed but didn't fully understand, translating advanced technology into the supernatural framework that made sense to them. Mainstream scholars reject this reading as anachronistic, projecting modern concerns and concepts onto ancient texts that had entirely different purposes and worldviews. The conventional scholarly interpretation sees the Atrahasis creation account as theology, explaining humanity's place in the cosmic hierarchy and our relationship to the divine realm. We're created to serve the gods, to perform the labor they find burdensome, to maintain temples and provide offerings. But we're not entirely separate from the divine. We carry within us the Te'emah of We'ilah, making us capable of reason and consciousness. This dual nature explains human experience. We're mortal and limited like clay, but we're also aware and capable of wisdom like the gods. We exist at the boundary between two realms, participating in both but fully belonging to neither. The Genesis creation account in the Hebrew Bible shows clear influence from these earlier Mesopotamian traditions. God forms Adam from the dust of the ground and breathes into him the breath of life. The Adam becomes a living being, created in God's image but formed from earth. The Hebrew text uses wordplay. Adam, human, comes from Adama, ground, emphasizing the connection between humanity and the physical earth. Most biblical scholars acknowledge that the Genesis author was familiar with Mesopotamian creation myths, either through direct cultural contact or through inherited traditions. The Israelites spent time in Babylonian exile, where they would have encountered these stories. The parallels are too close to be coincidental. What's striking is how different the creation purposes are between the two traditions. In the Sumerian account, humans are created explicitly to work, to relieve the gods of labor they found too burdensome. There's no pretense that we're special or beloved. We're useful, that's all, and our value derives from our utility. In the Genesis account, humans are created to have dominion over the earth, to be stewards of creation, formed in the divine image and given authority. It's a more elevated vision of human purpose, though even in Genesis, the Adam is placed in the garden to work it and take care of it. Service remains part of human purpose, but the framing is different. We serve God through caring for creation, not because gods need someone to dig their canals. Comparative mythology reveals similar creation stories across many cultures. The Egyptian god Khnum fashions humans on a potter's wheel. The Greek Prometheus shapes humans from clay and gives them fire stolen from the gods. Chinese mythology describes the goddess Nuwa, creating humans from yellow earth. Norse tradition has the gods Ask and Embla formed from trees. These widespread stories of gods creating humans from earthly materials suggest either a common archetypal pattern in human imagination. We come from the earth and return to it, so of course our origin stories involve earth or clay, or possibly, though more speculatively, a shared memory of actual creation events that different cultures interpreted through their own theological lenses. The emphasis on mixing in the Sumerian account, combining earthly and divine elements to create something new, might also reflect observations about heredity and breeding. Ancient Mesopotamians raised livestock and cultivated crops. They understood that traits pass from parents to offspring, that selective breeding produces specific characteristics. They practiced horticulture, grafting different plant varieties together. The concept of creating a new type of being by combining elements from two sources wasn't purely theoretical. It was something they did regularly with plants and animals. Perhaps the creation of humans through divine earthly mixing was understood as a similar process, scaled up to cosmic significance. The number of humans created in the first batch, 14, 7 males and 7 females, has prompted various interpretations. 7 is a significant number in Mesopotamian culture, appearing frequently in ritual contexts. 14 might simply be doubling 7 for symmetry, or it might represent something about population genetics, a minimum viable breeding population for genetic diversity. Alternative researchers have noted that 14 pairs would allow for avoiding inbreeding across at least 2 or 3 generations, providing enough genetic variation for a sustainable population. Mainstream scholars see the numbers as symbolic, part of the literary structure, rather than literal biology. What cannot be disputed is that the Sumerians did not view humanity as the crown of creation or the point of cosmic history. We were an afterthought, a solution to a labor problem, created to serve beings who were themselves created, who themselves existed within a hierarchy they didn't control. This is a profoundly different worldview from modern secular humanism, which places humans at the center of our own story, or from Abrahamic monotheism, which grants humans special dignity as beings created in the divine image. The Sumerian view is humbler and darker, acknowledging our contingency, our instrumentality, the fact that we exist to fulfill purposes we didn't choose. The clay from which we were made has long since returned to mud. The birth goddesses who gestated the first humans are silent now, their temples ruins, their names spoken only by scholars. But the questions raised by these ancient creation accounts remain alive. Where did we come from? Are we special or ordinary? Do we exist for a purpose or by accident? And what does it mean to be, as the Sumerians knew, creatures mixed from earth and something else, mortal but dreaming of the stars? When you sit with the Sumerian king list's pre-flood chronology, really trying to make sense of what it claims, the numbers become almost hypnotic in their impossibility. Alulim ruled for 28,800 years, Alalangar for 36,000 years, Enmenluana for 43,200 years. Add them all together across 8 kings and 5 cities, and you arrive at 200 years of kingship before the flood swept over and reset everything. These aren't approximations or poetic exaggerations. They're specific figures that appear consistently across multiple copies of the text, separated by centuries and found at different archaeological sites. The precision suggests intentionality, as though the numbers matter, as though they're encoding information that we're supposed to be able to decode. Mainstream scholarship has a straightforward explanation. These numbers are symbolic, not literal. They represent mythic time, the deep past before human memory begins, when gods walked the earth and the rules governing existence were different. Many ancient cultures use similar devices, placing their origins in an impossibly distant past to establish legitimacy and divine sanction. The Egyptian king lists include dynasties of gods who ruled before human pharaohs. Hindu texts describe yugas, cosmic ages lasting hundreds of thousands of years. Biblical genealogies give pre-flood patriarchs lifespans of 900+ years. The pattern is universal enough to suggest it's a common feature of how pre-modern cultures constructed sacred history. There's mathematical elegance to the Sumerian numbers that supports this symbolic interpretation. The Sumerians used a sexagesimal system, base 60 mathematics, and the pre-flood rain lengths are built from multiples of 3,600, which is 60 squared. This number, called a shar in Sumerian, had cosmic significance. It represented a great cycle, a divine unit of time. Expressing mythic rains in multiples of shar makes sense if The goal is establishing antiquity beyond human reckoning. The numbers aren't meant to be counted as literal years. They're meant to inspire awe, to place kingship's origin beyond the reach of memory or verification. But then there's the problem of the transition. After the flood, reign lengths drop to 1,200 years, then gradually decrease further until they reach normal human lifespans that match archaeological and historical evidence from other sources. Kings from the 3rd millennium BCE have reign lengths of 15, 20, 40 years, completely plausible, completely verifiable. Some scholars believe this transition shows the text moving from myth into history, from symbolic time into recordable time. Others wonder why, if the entire pre-flood section is invented, the transition is so methodical and the post-flood reigns become historically accurate so quickly. It's not a sudden shift from pure fantasy to pure fact. It's a gradual descent from impossible to improbable to realistic. Could the numbers encode something other than literal years? Some researchers have proposed that the pre-flood reigns might represent astronomical cycles observed over long periods and attributed to divine kings rather than counted as individual lifespans. The number 25 now and 20, close to the precession cycle, factors into some of the calculations. The 3,600-year Shar might relate to planetary cycles or stellar observations. If ancient astronomers tracked the sky for centuries and wanted to preserve their data, they might encode it as reign lengths, creating a double meaning: mythological on the surface, astronomical underneath. This interpretation remains speculative, but it takes seriously the precision of the numbers while acknowledging their literal impossibility. Another theory suggests the numbers might use a different calendar system entirely. Maybe a year in the pre-flood section doesn't mean what we think it means. Perhaps it refers to months or seasons, rather than full solar cycles. This would reduce the timescales significantly. A reign of 2,800 years becomes 2,400 actual years if each unit is a month. That's still impossibly long for a human lifespan, but closer to the realm of plausibility for a dynasty or a long period of stable governance. However, there's no evidence in Sumerian texts that they use the word for year to mean anything other than a full annual cycle. This theory requires assuming a meaning shift that isn't documented elsewhere. Some alternative researchers take the numbers literally or semi-literally, arguing they might represent the reigns of non-human beings or genetically modified humans with extended lifespans. If the Anunnaki were extraterrestrial or technologically advanced, perhaps they did live for tens of thousands of years, either naturally or through life extension technology. The tablets would then be accurate historical records from humanity's perspective. These beings really did rule for those lengths of time, and humans, observing their apparent immortality, recorded what they witnessed. The flood becomes a reset point, not just mythologically, but historically, marking when direct Anunnaki rulership ended and more typically human governance began. This interpretation faces significant challenges. There's no archaeological evidence of any civilization in Mesopotamia before approximately 5400 BCE at the earliest, and that's at Eridu with its first simple temple. The cities named in the king list, Eridu, Bad Tabira, Larag, Sipar, Shurupak, have been excavated, and their occupation layers don't extend back 200 years or anything close to it. If beings ruled those cities for such immense periods, where's the physical evidence? Where are the hundreds of thousands of years of accumulated artifacts, the massive stratigraphic deposits, the evolutionary changes in pottery styles and building techniques that should mark such vast time spans? One response to this challenge suggests we're looking in The wrong places, or that evidence from such ancient times, would be nearly impossible to recognize. If a catastrophic flood or other disaster destroyed most physical traces, only fragments would survive, and those fragments might be misinterpreted or dated incorrectly. The Younger Dryas period, roughly 12,800 to 11,600 years ago, saw rapid climate change and environmental upheaval that could have destroyed evidence of earlier cultures. Some researchers propose that the Sumerian king list preserves memory of civilizations that existed before the Younger Dryas, with timescales distorted through oral transmission across millennia. Mainstream archaeology remains unpersuaded. The development of Mesopotamian civilization from agricultural villages to complex city-states is well documented archaeologically, showing gradual accumulation of technology, art styles, and social complexity from about 6000 BCE onward. There's no gap requiring explanation by lost advanced civilizations. The king list's pre-flood section is mythological, full stop, serving theological and political purposes in establishing the divine origin of Sumerian kingship. The numbers are symbolic, designed to place beginnings beyond human memory, connecting historical kings to cosmic time. Yet the question persists. Why these specific numbers? Why such consistency across different versions of the text? Why the methodical transition from impossible to plausible reign lengths if the entire enterprise is fictional? Perhaps the answer is that ancient scribes took their work more seriously than we give them credit for. They weren't making random things up, but carefully preserving received traditions, even when those traditions seemed to contradict observable reality. Perhaps they believed they were recording truth, even if the nature of that truth wasn't what modern historians would recognize as historical fact. Or perhaps we're missing something. Perhaps there are forms of historical transmission and truth preservation that don't fit our categories of literal fact versus pure myth. Perhaps memory can preserve real events while transforming their specifics beyond recognition, leaving us with documents that feel both true and impossible at the same time. The tablets sit in their museum cases, offering their precise, impossible numbers to anyone willing to read them, declining to explain what framework would make those numbers make sense. We may never resolve the 241 200-year problem. We may be asking the wrong questions, using the wrong interpretive tools, looking for the wrong kind of answers. But the numbers themselves remain, pressed into clay with the same careful precision that recorded trade accounts and legal contracts, treated by ancient scribes as information worth preserving forever. The Sumerian accounts of the Anunnaki don't exist in isolation. When you start looking at creation myths, flood narratives, and stories of beings from the sky across different cultures, patterns emerge that are either remarkable coincidences, evidence of cultural diffusion along ancient trade routes, or possibly reflections of something deeper, shared human experiences, or shared human history that got encoded in similar mythological structures. Consider the Egyptian concept of the Ak, often translated as shining ones or effective spirits. These were beings who existed between the human and divine realms, associated with light and the stars. In Egyptian theology, pharaohs could become Ak after death, joining the imperishable stars that never set below the horizon. But there are also references to Ak as primordial beings who existed before human civilization, teacher figures who brought knowledge to the Nile Valley. The parallels with the Anunnaki are loose but present, beings from above, connected to stars, bringing civilization to humans. The Vedic traditions of India describe conflicts between different classes of divine beings, the Devas and Asuras, often portrayed as gods and demons, though that translation oversimplifies a complex relationship. In some texts, both groups are divine but have different alignments and purposes. They compete for power, make alliances, break them, engage in cosmic struggles that affect the human realm. Some of the Asherahs are portrayed as teachers who gave humans knowledge of arts and sciences, though their motivations weren't always benevolent. The structure resembles Mesopotamian theology. Multiple tiers of divine beings with competing agendas, some helpful to humans and some indifferent or hostile. Cross the ocean to Mesoamerica, and you find Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent deity who appears across multiple cultures: Aztec, Maya, earlier Olmec traditions. Quetzalcoatl is described as bringing civilization to humans, teaching agriculture, writing, mathematics, astronomy, arts, and crafts. He's often portrayed as coming from across the sea, establishing order and knowledge, then departing with a promise to return. The myths vary in details, but share the core pattern: a civilizing being from elsewhere, neither quite human nor purely spiritual, who shaped human culture and then left. Australian Aboriginal traditions, some of which are among the oldest continuous cultural narratives on Earth, include the Wandjina, sky beings depicted in rock art across the Kimberley region of northwest Australia. The paintings show humanoid figures with large round heads, faces that sometimes lack mouths, surrounded by radiating lines suggesting light or energy. Aboriginal oral traditions describe the Wandjina as creators and lawgivers who came in the dream time, shaped the landscape, established the rules by which humans should live, then departed into the sky or merged with sacred sites. The rock art depicting them has been maintained and retouched for thousands of years, some original paintings dating back at least 4,000 years, possibly much older. The pattern that repeats across these diverse cultures includes several common elements: beings who come from the sky or from elsewhere, who are more powerful and knowledgeable than humans, who teach or give gifts of civilization, who often have internal conflicts or divided purposes toward humanity, and who eventually depart or withdraw from direct involvement, leaving humans to manage with the knowledge and systems they've been given. Sometimes there's a promise of return. Sometimes there's a warning about what will happen if humans forget or violate what they've been taught. Mainstream anthropology explains these patterns through several mechanisms. First, independent invention. Humans across cultures face similar existential questions about origins, meaning, and the source of knowledge, so they develop similar narrative structures to address those questions. The idea of wise teachers from above might be a universal way of attributing cultural achievements to sources beyond ordinary human capacity, reflecting humility about our own inventiveness or explaining rapid cultural development that seems too fast to be purely human innovation. Second, diffusion. Cultures in contact share stories, and those stories spread along trade routes, adapting to local contexts but maintaining core elements. The Mesopotamian flood story influenced Hebrew tradition demonstrably. Trade networks connected distant regions more extensively than we often assume. Ideas could travel from Sumer to Egypt to the Indus Valley and beyond over centuries, transforming as they moved but preserving recognizable patterns. Third, archetypal psychology. Carl Jung's concept of collective unconscious suggests humans might share deep psychological structures that produce similar symbols and narratives across cultures without direct contact. Sky beings and wise teachers might be archetypal figures that arise naturally from human consciousness, reflecting our relationship to authority, knowledge, and the unknown. Alternative researchers, Propose a fourth explanation, that these similar stories reflect similar historical events. If an advanced culture or visiting group did interact with multiple early civilizations across the planet, teaching technologies and organizational methods, then the similarity of myths isn't coincidental but memorial. Different cultures interpreted the same or similar encounters through their own frameworks, creating narratives that sound mythological to us, but preserve memories of actual contact. The beings weren't supernatural, but appeared that way to less technologically developed observers. Over thousands of years, memory transformed into myth, but the core pattern, visitors from elsewhere bringing knowledge, persisted. This explanation requires supposing either an advanced ancient human civilization that left minimal archaeological traces, or extraterrestrial contact, or some other scenario involving knowledge transfer from an external source. Mainstream archaeology finds no compelling evidence for either. The development of agriculture, metallurgy, writing, and complex social organization appears independently in multiple regions at different times, with each showing gradual accumulation of techniques rather than sudden gifting of complete systems. Cultural evolution from simple to complex is well documented archaeologically and doesn't require external intervention to explain. Yet there are some genuine anomalies that complicate the narrative of purely gradual, independent development. Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, dated to 9600 BCE, shows monumental architecture and complex symbolic art thousands of years before agriculture supposedly enabled such achievements. The Antikythera mechanism, an ancient Greek astronomical calculator from around 100 BCE, demonstrates mechanical sophistication that wasn't matched again for over 1,000 years. The precision of Egyptian pyramid construction, the astronomical alignments of sites across multiple continents, the mathematical knowledge embedded in ancient structures. These don't prove ancient astronauts or lost advanced civilizations, but they do suggest that ancient peoples were more capable and knowledgeable than 19th and 20th century scholars initially assumed. Perhaps the truth involves multiple factors operating simultaneously. Ancient humans were more ingenious than we've credited. Cultural contact was more extensive. Some developments happened more rapidly than gradualist models suggest. And maybe, though this remains speculation, there were sources of knowledge we haven't yet identified. Not necessarily extraterrestrial, but perhaps advanced human cultures from earlier periods whose remains are buried under risen seas or destroyed by the catastrophes of the Younger Dryas period. The similarities across cultures could reflect all these factors at once: shared human psychology, cultural diffusion, independent invention, and possibly memories of actual historical events that don't fit our current understanding of the past. We don't have to choose one explanation and reject all others. History is messy. Memory is complicated. Truth often comes in layers that contradict each other superficially while each containing valid insights. What seems clear is that across cultures and millennia, humans have told themselves stories about receiving civilization from beings who came from somewhere else, somewhere above or beyond. These stories served clear purposes: explaining origins, establishing authority, teaching moral lessons, connecting humans to cosmic order. Whether they also preserve fragments of literal history beneath their mythological structure remains an open question, one that new archaeological discoveries periodically reopen just when it seemed settled. The stars that the Sumerians, Egyptians, Vedic Indians, Maya, and Aboriginal Australians all watched and named are still up there, still turning through their ancient patterns. And the questions those different cultures asked: where did we come from? Who taught us what we know? Are we alone in the universe? are the same questions we're asking now, using different methods but driven by the same fundamental wonder about our place in the cosmos and the origins of everything we call civilization. The Sumerian language died as a spoken tongue sometime around 2000 BCE, replaced gradually by Akkadian as the dominant language of Mesopotamia. But the stories didn't die with it. Scribes continued copying Sumerian texts for another 1,500 years, translating them into Akkadian, then Babylonian, then Assyrian, treating these ancient narratives as sacred literature worth preserving even when the language they were written in had become a scholarly curiosity rather than a living means of communication. The Epic of Gilgamesh, the Atrahasis creation epic, the Enuma Elish, the flood narratives, all of these were copied and recopied in temple libraries and palace archives across changing empires, surviving conquests, and cultural transformations because enough people in each generation believed they mattered. The transmission chain stretched across millennia. When the Babylonian Empire rose to power in the early 2nd millennium BCE, they absorbed Sumerian religious and literary traditions, incorporating them into their own cultural identity. The Assyrians, who built their empire further north, did the same, creating vast libraries that included copies of ancient Sumerian texts alongside contemporary works. The most famous of these libraries belonged to Ashurbanipal, king of Assyria from 668 to 627 BCE, who assembled over 30,000 tablets at his palace in Nineveh. Ashurbanipal could read Akkadian and apparently had scholarly interests. His library included not just administrative documents and propaganda, but literature, scientific texts, historical records, and religious works from across the Near Eastern world. When Nineveh fell to a coalition of Babylonians and Medes in 612 BCE, the palace burned. The fire was catastrophic for the city, but accidental preservation for the library. The flames baked the clay tablets, hardening them beyond what normal kiln firing achieved. The library collapsed into rubble and was buried under centuries of accumulated debris, forgotten entirely. For over 2,000 years, those tablets lay beneath the ground, holding their stories in darkness while empires rose and fell above them, while Christianity and Islam spread across the region, while the very memory of Assyria faded into biblical references and fragmentary classical texts. The rediscovery began in the mid-19th century, when European archaeologists and adventurers started excavating the Great Mound at Kuyunjik, across the Tigris River from modern Mosul in Iraq. Between 1845 and 1851, Austin Henry Layard and Hormuzd Rassam uncovered the ruins of Ashurbanipal's palace and began shipping thousands of inscribed tablets back to the British Museum in London. At the time, no one could read cuneiform. The tablets were cataloged and stored. Mysterious artifacts from a lost civilization, their contents locked behind a script that had been dead for nearly 2,000 years. The breakthrough in deciphering cuneiform came through the work of multiple scholars over several decades. Henry Rawlinson played a crucial role, copying and analyzing the massive trilingual inscription carved into a cliff face at Behistun in Persia, which contained the same text in Old Persian, Elamite, and Babylonian cuneiform. By comparing the scripts and using the known values of Old Persian characters, he and other scholars began unlocking the meanings of Babylonian signs. By the 1850s, they could read Akkadian fairly well. Sumerian took longer because it's a language isolate, unrelated to any modern tongue, but by the early 20th century, that too had been deciphered. George Smith, a young engraver turned archaeologist who worked at the British Museum, made one of the most dramatic discoveries in 1872. While sorting through fragments from Ashurbanipal's library, he found a tablet describing a great flood, a man warned by a god, building a boat, riding out a deluge that destroyed the world, sending out birds to find dry land, making sacrifice when the waters receded. The parallels to the biblical flood in Genesis were immediately obvious. Smith announced his finding to the Society of Biblical Archaeology in December 1872, and the news caused a sensation. Here was proof that the biblical flood story wasn't unique Hebrew revelation, but part of a much older Near Eastern mythological tradition. The Bible's authors had inherited their flood narrative from Mesopotamian sources, adapting it to fit their own monotheistic theology. This discovery fundamentally changed how people in the West understood the Bible and ancient history. The biblical narratives weren't sui generis divine revelations. They were products of a specific cultural and historical context, drawing on older traditions. From Sumer, Babylon, and Assyria, Genesis's creation account, with God forming humans from dust, echoed the older Sumerian story of humans created from clay. The Tower of Babel reflected memories of Mesopotamian ziggurats. The patriarchal genealogies, with their impossibly long pre-flood lifespans, paralleled the Sumerian king list's structure of mythic time, transitioning to historical time after a catastrophic deluge. The scholarly world embraced these discoveries, recognizing them as windows into humanity's oldest written traditions. But the general public's reception was more complicated. Some saw the Mesopotamian origins of biblical stories as proof that the Bible was merely myth, no different from Sumerian legends. Others argued that both traditions preserved memories of real events, a real flood, a real creation, each culture interpreting these events through their own theological frameworks. The debates continue today, not just among scholars, but in broader cultural conversations about history, religion, and the reliability of ancient texts. In 1976, a journalist and self-taught scholar named Zecharia Sitchin published The 12th Planet, the first book in his Earth Chronicles series. Sitchin proposed that the Anunnaki, described in Sumerian texts, were extraterrestrial beings from a planet called Nibiru, which orbits the Sun in a long elliptical path, bringing it into the inner solar system every 3,600 years. He argued that these beings came to Earth around 450,000 years ago to mine gold, created humans through genetic engineering to serve as workers, and ruled directly until a catastrophic flood forced them to withdraw. His interpretation of cuneiform texts and cylinder seals to support this theory became hugely popular, spawning a genre of ancient astronaut literature that continues to sell millions of books and generate countless documentaries. Professional Sumerologists and archaeologists criticized Sitchin's work extensively, pointing to mistranslations, misinterpretations of astronomical symbols, and selective use of evidence that ignored contradictory data. Sitchin lacked formal training in cuneiform languages, and his readings of texts often contradicted established scholarship. The planet Nibiru doesn't exist in Sumerian cosmology in the way Sitchin described. The term appears in later Babylonian astronomy, referring to Jupiter, or a crossing point of celestial bodies, not a 12th planet in our solar system. No credible astronomer accepts the existence of Nibiru in the form Sitchin proposed, as such a planet would have gravitational effects on other planets' orbits that we don't observe. Yet, Sitchin's work accomplished something significant, whatever its scholarly flaws. It brought Sumerian mythology into popular consciousness, sparked widespread interest in ancient astronaut theories, and raised questions about human origins and the possibility of extraterrestrial contact that continue to resonate. His book sold over 20 million copies worldwide. People who would never read academic journals or visit museums encountered the Anunnaki through Sitchin's lens, and some of them then pursued deeper study, learning about the actual texts and archaeological evidence. Even now, decades after the first translations of Sumerian tablets, new discoveries continue. Excavations in Iraq, when security conditions allow, still unearth tablets from ancient libraries. Scholars are still working through the hundreds of thousands of cuneiform tablets held in museum collections worldwide. Many have been cataloged, but not fully translated or published. Advanced imaging techniques are revealing text on damaged tablets that couldn't be read with earlier methods. And our understanding of Sumerian culture, religion, and history continues to evolve as new evidence emerges, and old evidence is re-evaluated with fresh perspectives. The questions raised by these ancient texts haven't been resolved. If anything, they've multiplied as we've learned more. The Sumerian king list still claims 8 kings ruled for 200 years before the flood. The creation epics still describe humans as mixed beings, created to serve. The astronomical knowledge still seems impressive for naked-eye observers. The similarities to myths from other cultures still invite explanation. And the Anunnaki themselves remain what they've always been, beings who exist in the space between history and mythology, gods or visitors or symbols, depending on how you choose to interpret the evidence. The tablets continue to rest in museums, patient witnesses to debates they can't settle. Eridu's ruins still rise from the Iraqi desert, layers of temples built one atop another over 3,000 years. The stars the Sumerian priests tracked and named still wheel overhead, unchanged by human interpretation. And we, the latest in a long line of people trying to make sense of these ancient stories, continue asking the same questions our ancestors asked. Where did we come from? Who were the Anunnaki? And what does it mean that these stories have persisted for 4,000 years, surviving the death of the language they were written in, the fall of the civilizations that created them, and the passage of enough time to bury cities beneath desert sand? The memory persists. The questions persist. And somewhere in that persistence, in our continued fascination with these oldest of written stories, the Anunnaki remain alive, not as physical beings walking the earth, but as ideas that won't let go, mysteries that refuse to be fully solved or fully dismissed. You're still here, in whatever space holds you right now. The room around you hasn't changed. The air is the same temperature it was when we began. If there's darkness outside your window, it's the same darkness that covered Mesopotamia 5,000 years ago, when scribes finished their work and set down their styluses, letting the clay tablets dry in the cooling evening air. The stars they saw then are the stars you could see now if you stepped outside and looked up. The same light, traveling across the same distances, marking time in the only way that really matters. By continuing, by persisting, by simply being there, night after night. The tablets we've been thinking about tonight still exist. They sit in climate-controlled storage rooms at Oxford, at the British Museum, at the Louvre, at the University of Pennsylvania Museum, and dozens of other institutions worldwide. The cuneiform marks are still sharp, pressed into clay that was soft for maybe an hour 4,000 years ago and has been stone hard ever since. You could visit them if you wanted to. You could stand in front of the Weld Blundell Prism and read the names of the 8 pre-flood kings, their impossible reign lengths, the simple statement that the flood swept over. The information is there, available, patiently waiting for anyone who wants to look. Eridu's ruins remain too, though fewer people visit them. The site lies in southern Iraq, not easily accessible, subject to the political realities of a region that has seen too much war. But the Temple Mound is still there, that layered structure of 18 successive temples built one on top of another across 3 millennia. The mud brick has eroded, weathered by wind and occasional rain, but the platform endures. Archaeologists have mapped it, documented it, published their findings. The fish bones are gone, carried to museums or dissolved into soil, but the pattern remains visible. This place was sacred once, maintained with devotion across longer spans of time than most modern nations have existed. The questions we've explored tonight don't have neat resolutions. Were the Anunnaki gods, extraterrestrials, memories of an earlier advanced culture, or symbolic representations of natural forces? The texts support multiple interpretations. The archaeological evidence constrains some possibilities, but doesn't definitively eliminate any of them. Scholars continue to debate. New discoveries occasionally shift the conversation. But the core mystery persists, and maybe that's appropriate. Maybe some questions serve us better by remaining open, by inviting each generation to grapple with them, using whatever tools and perspectives that generation possesses. What we can say with certainty is smaller but still significant. People in ancient Mesopotamia created the world's first complex urban civilization. They invented writing, giving humanity the ability to preserve thought outside living memory. They watched the sky with patient attention and recorded what they saw with impressive accuracy. They told stories about beings called the Anunnaki, who came from the heavens and shaped human destiny. They believed these stories enough to copy them carefully for over 1,000 years. And those stories, whether history or mythology or some hybrid of both, have survived to reach us across a span of time, so vast it's hard to really comprehend. The wind still blows across the Mesopotamian plain, moving over buried cities and exposed ruins without distinction. The Tigris and Euphrates still flow, though dammed now and managed in ways the ancient engineers never imagined. The desert holds its secrets with the patience deserts are known for, revealing fragments when erosion or excavation exposes them, keeping the rest hidden until some future generation develops the tools or the interest to dig deeper. Time continues its work, which is simply to pass, to accumulate, to separate us from what came before while leaving traces that memory can follow. You don't need to decide tonight what the Anunnaki were, or whether the numbers in the king list mean anything. You don't need to choose between mainstream archaeology and alternative theories, between scientific skepticism and openness to unconventional possibilities. The questions will still be there tomorrow, and next week, and next year, waiting with the same patience. The tablets themselves have shown across 4 millennia. The mystery doesn't demand resolution. It simply exists, like the stars, like the ruins, like the marks pressed into clay by hands that have long since returned to dust. Rest now. Let the questions settle into whatever space they occupy in your mind, not heavy or urgent, but just present, like background stars you're not actively looking at, but know are there. The story of the Anunnaki, whatever truth it holds, continues in the wondering, in the searching, in the patient examination of evidence, and the humble acknowledgement of what we don't know. It continues in you, listening now in the darkness, connected across impossible distance to people who looked at the same sky and asked the same questions and left their answers pressed into clay, hoping someone in an unimaginable future might find them and understand. The stars turn, the clay remembers, and somewhere between certainty and mystery, between what we can prove and what we can only wonder about, the story remains unfinished, ongoing, waiting.